Good morning, everyone. Welcome. And we have more participants filing in. I would welcome you all, and I'll introduce myself in just a moment. Just wanted to say, please feel free to introduce yourself. Make sure that you select that you're posting to everyone and not just to the host and panelists, and introduce yourself in the chat if you're comfortable doing so. It's nice to have a sense of who's here in the Zoom room and participating in our speaker series this morning. So welcome, my name is Danielle Martin. I'm a family doctor at Women's College Hospital, and I have the honor of being the chair of the Department of Family and Community Medicine here at the University of Toronto. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you all to this morning's New Horizons session, our 9th in the New Horizons series. Particularly today, it's wonderful to see that we have a very broad range of registrants, about a 50-50 split between people from inside our department, learners and colleagues and staff, and other colleagues from across the university and across Canada, in fact, as we come together to think about the future of healthcare and family medicine. And of course, also to commemorate National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which is officially tomorrow. So before I welcome today's speaker and hand over to Dr. Park to bring greetings from our Indigenous Leadership Circle, I just want to give a little bit of context, because we do have so many new folks joining us this morning, about this speaker series and what this series is really about, why it was founded. This beautiful image that you see before you, those of you who've attended before are familiar with it, was really the inspiration for the speaker series, which is about dreaming big about the future of primary care and family medicine, and also acknowledging that if we are going to lead and lead the way into new ways of thinking about health, that we need to draw fresh perspectives, not only by talking to one another, but to reaching out to colleagues in the broadest range of fields, in the arts, in public health, community activism, social sciences, and beyond. And I hope that the fresh perspectives that are offered by the wonderful colleagues who've been presenting throughout this speaker series can be an inspiration to all of us as we look to the future. So this image that you see on the screen is a spectacular photo by an artist named Merrill McMaster, who's a Canadian artist with Plains, Cree, British, and Dutch ancestry. And it's entitled, "Lead Me to Places I Could Never Find on My Own." It's a second in a series called As Immense as the Sky. And we'll post the link to Merrill's work in the chat. I know that many faculty members were able to go and see her show. I guess it was last year already, which was really phenomenal. And she's given us permission to use this image, and has shared with us a quote in which she talks about navigating by the stars, and the notion that stories of the constellations, which get passed down over generations within both Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultures, are a big part of the history of navigation. And that this image was taken at the Badlands in Grasslands National Park, which is a dark sky preserve, a great place to see the stars, and one of the largest natural tracts of grassland in North America. So what she says is, perched atop my hat, this is a self-portrait, are the indigo bunting birds who use the stars to navigate. Carrying the universe, they lead me to the stars as I seek answers in the sky. So for this series, I hope that we can draw on many different traditions of navigation and chart our own way as a department. And in thinking about ways to kick off important sessions such as this one, that we think it's important not only to acknowledge the land on which the university operates, but the present day incredible assets and contributions and strengths that our Indigenous colleagues bring in the arts and in our work. And so with that, I'm going to pass to Dr. Sarah Park, who will be introducing our speaker this morning, and we'll be saying a few words about our Indigenous Leadership Circle as we commemorate or acknowledge the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, which is officially tomorrow. Over to you, Dr. Park.
Gwe Abjilida Daluisi Sarah, Nin Manuja Okolnu, Winnipegisi Uktahamguk. Hi and welcome everyone. My name is Sarah. My background is settler European and Halipin Mi'kmaq First Nation, and my family roots are in Newfoundland, or as Uktahamguk translates, land across the water. I'm honored to be here today to celebrate our upcoming National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. For me, this is a day of mixed feelings of reflection as to the history of cultural genocide against Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also a celebration of incredible resilience and revitalization of culture despite that history. And looking forward to the future we're able to mindfully build societally as we fully embrace truth and make real strides towards reconciliation. I've had the pleasure of working with the DFCM on that piece of what's next and how to continue along the path of reconciliation. Our collective aim at the Indigenous Leadership Circle is for Indigenous self-governance at the DFCM, to implement tangible actions to support self-determination of Indigenous health leaders and communities associated with the DFCM, and to provide or improve access to care for the thousands of First Nations, Inuit, Métis who continue to be underserved. This aim of advancing reconciliation and addressing anti-Indigenous racism certainly links to decolonizing land-body relations. So without further ado, I will introduce our speaker today, and we're delighted to welcome Professor Murphy. Professor Murphy is a professor in the History Department and Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. They are a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Science and Technology Studies and Environmental Data Justice, and co-director of the Technoscience Research Unit at U of T and the Indigenous Environmental Data Justice Lab, where community members and academics collaborate together to address pollution in Canada's Chemical Valley. Murphy is a prolific writer and author of 4 books and numerous publications and policy papers with a scholarly focus on technoscience as it relates to environmental justice, data politics, chemical exposures, reproduction, racial justice, and Indigenous science and technology studies. They are Red River Métis from Winnipeg. I will now pass it over to Professor Murphy. Wilolio, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Danielle. It's exciting to be here today. I thank you for this invitation. I talked to a lot of different scientists, mostly like chemists and like AI people and programmers and toxicologists, but I don't often talk to doctors. So this should be an interesting morning. I'm going to share my slides. Okay, and I think it worked. So what I'm going to be talking to you today about is comes from the work that Sarah just described. What if what you know about land and bodies is wrong? And when I say wrong here, I mean maybe empirically wrong, but also maybe ethically wrong. Like Danielle and Sarah mentioned, today is National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And as Sarah mentioned, it's a challenging day. It's a day of really mixed feelings. It's a day where we're really asked to think about the impacts of the residential school system. And I think it's also important to look at what's happened with Truth and Reconciliation since 2015 and the 4-volume report that came out of that. The Yellowhead Institute here at TMU puts out an annual report about the calls to action. And sadly, in the last annual report, only 13 of the 94 calls to action have been completed, and none of the health calls to action have been repeated. So while I think it is a day that's important to recognize and honor survivors of residential schools and learn about the truth of genocide here in Canada, I think as health professionals, it's probably really important to look at those calls for action. And I really recommend this Yellowhead report as a good starting place for looking at them comprehensively. So this is my part of my lab. This is the Environmental Data Justice Lab with my wonderful colleagues. It's an all Indigenous lab, and they're all very fierce. I'm Red River Métis from Winnipeg, but I've been living here in Toronto since 2001. And this is a crew that has, as Sarah mentioned, both community researchers, particularly Anishinaabe researchers from Aamjiwnaang First Nation, as well as Métis and Quechua researchers who are all coming together around what might Indigenous environmental data justice be. And we're part of a field, a very small field, but it's growing, called Indigenous Science and Technology Studies. And the university, and probably a med school, is filled with research legacies and traditions and habits of studying Indigenous people. And what Indigenous Science and Technology Studies does is it's Indigenous people studying science and technology. So it's flipping the script or flipping the tables on how research works in the university. We are studying you as opposed to you studying us. And so that's an important first point to keep in mind as I talk about our work at this lab. Ontario's Chemical Valley is about 3.5 hours from Toronto. And it's surprising how much people in Toronto don't realize that Chemical Valley is where 40% of Canada's petrochemicals are refined. It is, probably one of the 2 biggest pollution hotspots in all of Canada. And more than that, it is there because it's the site of the world's first commercial oil field. It is a location in which fossil fuel capitalism has existed longer than pretty well any place else on Earth. There's a spot in Pennsylvania, there's a spot in Russia. They all kind of happened within like months of each other. But this is one of the oldest places on Earth where fossil fuel capitalism unrolled. And it happens that since all our land here in Canada is Indigenous land, Chemical Valley is on Indigenous land. It's on Anishinaabe land. It's on Three Fires Confederacy land, and it surrounds Aamjiwnaang First Nation. Aamjiwnaang used to be across. So the Chemical Valley exists between Lake Huron and Lake Erie along the St. Clair River. People may know Sarnia, so just south of Sarnia, north of Detroit. So if you can imagine cars being built and kind of the automobile world being built in Detroit and the oil world being built up in Sarnia, happening right here in our neighboring territories. So in Chemical Valley, there's some 50, it's always changing, facilities surrounding Aamjiwnaang First Nation. And we have in our work become obsessed with this particular refinery, which is the Imperial Oil Refinery. We believe this refinery is the oldest operating refinery in the world. Began in 1870. And if you think about that, that is the time of the Confederation of Canada. So the story of Chemical Valley and the story of this refinery helps us to connect the dots between fossil fuel pollution and its harms to health and land, colonialism, and Canada. This is a cell phone video taken in 2017 of a flare at the Imperial Oil Refinery. This is in February, I think it's February 23rd. And, like catching police violence on a cell phone, it's really hard sometimes to catch a pollution incident because they're hard to see. They often happen late at night. Sometimes they're odorless or not visible. But this is clearly visible to the eye. It's hard to deny. So everyone was taking their cell phone pictures of it. But this is what Imperial Oil said about that flare. They called it a grass fire. They said that there were no injuries and no emissions were detected. So I give you this example because this is just one shocking example of the quality of environmental pollution incident information that's provided to Aamjiwnaang First Nation. Just a few weeks ago, we launched this report called Data Colonialism in Chemical Valley that came out of Vanessa and BZ Gray, 2 lab members, who've been collecting the data, the pollution notifications in Chemical Valley for the last 10 years, since 2013, writing down each one, because you get a notification in the community like that, but it disappears. And we did this report with Yellowhead Institute, which is the Indigenous Policy Institute here. And part of our analysis is showing that the 5 top polluters or companies that report pollution incidences are the 5 companies that actually run the notification system and the environmental data system in Chemical Valley. It's run by an industry association. So they control the air monitoring as well as the notifications. And of those companies, 5 are top contributors to climate change globally. So we're talking about ExxonMobil, we're talking about Shell, we're talking about Saudi Aramco, we're talking about Abu Dhabi, like just really gigantic multinational fossil fuel companies that are at work on the territory of Aamjiwnaang. To try to understand this, I wanted to show you this map from, I think it's from 1870 something, can't remember exactly, where you begin to see on Aamjiwnaang's land property being laid out. You see the railroads arriving, you see the mission being put in, and to the right, you see the beginning, the refinery gets put in. So the refinery, the railroad, the mission all arrive at the same time. And then very rapidly, the whole area gets turned into property. And there's, so many stories of land theft. But it's not just turning the land into property that made Chemical Valley possible. It was also the residential school system. It was also the creation of the reserves that made possible the taking of the land from Aamjiwnaang and the creation of Chemical Valley. So when we think about the impacts of residential school system, when we think of the impacts of colonialism, one of the impacts is the existence of Chemical Valley as a place of intensive pollution that's largely unregulated. So in thinking about pollution this way, we think about it like my colleague, my Mischief colleague Max Liberon does, which is pollution is a form of colonialism. So with that as a kind of background, I want to go back to this question. What if the objects the university gives us to think the world are wrong? What is chemical pollution? So when we are thinking about chemical pollutions or chemicals, or when you think back to your organic chemistry course in pre-med or so on, right, we kind of given chemicals as molecules. And we're usually shown them as molecules by themselves and in atomic structures. And I call this chemicals in white space, because this is a way of understanding chemicals that removes them from all their relations of production, their relations in terms of one another as substance, as matter, and the ethical relations that they're part of. So if we think about chemical pollution in action, it is never a molecule by itself. It's an absurd way of understanding chemical pollution. And in fact, it's a way of understanding chemical pollution that does not serve justice. But nonetheless, we've built a world of regulating chemical pollution through the molecule, one molecule at a time, in a system that my colleague Evan Hepler-Smith calls molecular governance. It's not an accident that we do it this way. We do it because the American Chemical Society and the history of this kind of chemistry is not mostly concerned with pollutants. It's mostly concerned with creating intellectual property around novel substances and the ownership of molecules, whether it's drugs or any other kind of material. So that is where the logic of one molecule at a time comes from, not regulating pollution. But because of this molecular governance and this one molecule at a time, what we have here in Canada and as elsewhere is mostly something that another colleague, Kim Fortin, calls the informating of environmental governance. We mostly have data collected about molecules, which is not how the world works. So this way of thinking about, of regulating, of understanding chemical pollution and its damage is something that has not been a help. I'm kind of over it. So the question comes, so how can we think chemical pollution another way? And here we draw on the work of Eve Tuck, another colleague here at University of Toronto who does amazing Indigenous feminist methodology work, to say no to damage-based studies of chemical pollution and try to say yes to a desire-based approach, which is how can we have an understanding of chemical pollution that might get us to the activations of Indigenous cosmologies, Indigenous jurisdiction, Indigenous ways of being that we desire and want. So in this way, we want to think about chemical pollution as land body futures. So the first move is to think about land and bodies in a different way. We even tend to think about bodies as, I'm sure in med school this is the case, family medicine. Where do babies come from? Babies come from human bodies. They come from human bodies. And in thinking about land bodies, we think about where do bodies come from? Bodies come from land. They're manifestation of land. Reproduction isn't merely mom or parent, baby. It is land, fish, water, baby fish. It is that humans are emanations of land and waters and skies. So are other non-humans. And that in fact, we become in relationship to each other. So when we look at this image by Christy Belcourt, water is life, it's not just that water sustains us, but that we are emanations of water. Water is living and we are living emanations. And we are in relations of becoming and being with birds, fish. You see this kind of non-human in the stomach. We come from each other in relation of kinship and becoming. So this is a different way of understanding reproduction and how land bodies come together. And in this way of studying, this is another image by Christy Belcourt, Turtle Woman is making an offering of wampum to the plants and the rivers. These relations are not just where babies come from or where beings come from. Each of these relations is a form of treaty. They're each a form of law or ethical responsibility. And ethical responsibility and in law and treaty doesn't just happen between humans, but between non-humans and humans, and between non-humans and non-humans, between the turtles and the plant, between the fish and the bird. So this is a really different way of understanding land body. Law emanates from land, ethics emanates from land. And then finally, this image from Christy Belcourt is not just that our physical being comes from land body relations, but our song, our language, our teachings, our law, our humanness comes from this relation to land. So in this way, you cannot think health outside of this relation to land. Land and health always come together. So in thinking this way about chemical pollution, there's a report that if you ever want to read something on this, read this, Violence on the Land, Violence on Our Bodies by Native Youth Sexual Health Network. Understanding that when we breathe in a chemical pollutant, we breathe in all these relations, plus the disturbances to the land, right, that are now part of land, such as the pipeline, the dam, the refinery. We're not just breathing in the chemical. This is not Cartesian thinking, just like we're not just giving birth to the baby. We are not just breathing in the chemical, we're breathing in all these relations. So chemicals are so much bigger than we ever thought. They're in these relations of responsibility and they are relations of structure. So land bodies end up meeting fossil fuel multinationals. That Imperial refinery got bought by Standard Oil in the 19th century, which is ExxonMobil. That refinery is surrounded by pipelines. There's hundreds of pipelines in Chemical Valley. So caverns, hundreds of caverns underneath of tailings, railroads, the trucks, so on. I mean, it's just such a huge infrastructure to make possible this refinery. And we look at this refinery, we know it's in a relation of responsibility. We know that there's something like 90 entities that are responsible for the majority of emissions for climate justice. Just like we know, we can look at the top 5 companies in Chemical Valley, and they're responsible for 71% of the pollution incidents in Chemical Valley. And then we can look at the owners of Imperial Oil. So who owns this refinery? It's Exxon, and then a whole bunch of hedge funds, global hedge funds. Let's look at who owns Exxon. A whole bunch of more hedge funds. So really, we're not even just talking about ExxonMobil. We're not just talking about Shell when we're talking about our land-body relations. We are talking about a finance capital. And so we again can do work, research work, and show the exact banks, the exact big hedge funds, which are doing this concentrated harm. And so when we're breathing in those pollution, those chemicals, we're also breathing in those banking and financial relations. So when we go and look at this image and think about, again, like what is part of our land-body relations? It's not just the beautiful water, right? It's all of these obligations. So let's take one step further than that. We now, when you're in Amjanong, fossil fuel capitalism's been there for over 150 years. And the sense of how land that has been polluted for so long is treated in normative politics is to treat it as wasteland. You know, who would want to live there? But we hold as a first starting place that the land is still sacred, even after it has been damaged, hurt, injured, almost destroyed by fossil fuel pollution. And so are the people. So if we think about ourselves as manifestation of land, even in our most damaged by colonialism form, we are still sacred. And this is one of our beginning points for our desire-based understanding of environmental health. I use this term to think about it, alter life, the condition of alter life. Alter life names life already altered by things like colonialism, which is also life open to alteration. It's not over, we're still changing. It indexes collectivities of life recomposed by the molecular productions of capitalism in our own pasts and the past of our ancestors, as well as into our futures. And in Métis thought, I see alter life as always already a manifestation of land, of these relations to the many non-human beings, but also these social technical agencies. So let me make alter life a little more concrete for you. Here, my colleague Hannah Landecker calls it post-industrial metabolism. There is no biology in the human body that is not touched by this history I'm describing. So in our lab, we've done work on things like flame retardants, PBDEs, which are in almost every single person in Canada detectable through biomonitoring studies, PCBs, which are in every single person alive on the planet, in detectable quantities, and these are both endocrine disrupting chemicals that have effects on the development of being at low levels. We can look at the effect of bird song on the Great Lakes. So the songs of chickadees, the songs of starlings are altered from the presence of PCBs and other persistent organic chemicals. Now that's sometimes bad news, but sometimes it's not so bad news. Like with starlings, their song gets really like volatile and loud, and the starlings that have been kind of altered, their songs altered by chemicals, actually have the most luck and love. So I kind of love that part of it. And I don't know if people saw, this news. from this week. Microplastics are in the clouds. They're in the clouds now, and in all the cloud samples, and they're also in placenta. So there is no body that's not part of, that's not just a manifestation of land, but part of these disruptions to land. So what do we do with this? In our work, we go back to the community, we go back to youth and elders for wisdom about where to start again. This is some work we did with Amjanong on environmental data politics. How can we monitor chemical pollution differently? Here's what we were told, what we were taught. This is where to start. The voice of the land is in our language. We start with tradition and ceremony values rooted in land. We understand that the health of the land determines our responsibility to the future. We know that we do this work for our ancestors, to honor our ancestors in the land, past, present, and future. And we know that living well with the land is a human right and responsibility. So we manifest this in some technical things, like an app we made one's called Pollution Reporter, that is an Indigenous project of reframing chemical risk management and connecting polluters to chemicals, to health and land effects, using accessible language and Indigenous values. A little taste of it. But also this question about, can we reimagine what is a chemical? Can we say from the very start that chemicals have to be ethical substances? And the interesting thing is, when I first started talking about this, I'm almost done. When I first started talking about this, maybe 15 years ago, people treated me like I was really strange and weird, like to say we must change the cosmovision of chemicals. But now there's a lot more chemists who are interested in this question and their own feeling of the inadequacies of how we understand chemicals and chemical pollutants and substances. So here in Toronto, we just got a Canada First Research Excellence Grant. That is the biggest grant in the history of Canada on substance creation and using AI and automation for substance creation. An important part of it is that the social science part of it is Indigenous science studies, reframing what's an ethical substance for the future of chemistry. And so while this may sound like very aspirational, it can get very practical. So then I turn to you and I say, what are the objects and concepts needed for our alter futures? This alter life is in your clinical practice. It's in our kinships, it's in our relations. So what are the concepts and the objects we need for these alter futures? And in asking that question, I remind that that's not a damage-based question, but a desire-based question. So given what's unfolding around us in terms of environmental violence, how do we make those concepts so that in our toxic spaces we still grow strong and beautiful together? This is an image by Dylan Miner, who lives in Flint. Well, here's one from Elizabeth Lepense, another Métis artist. What kind of people do we become in our new land-water relations? What can we imagine for ourselves as kinds of altered life together and as being land body beings? So that's my conversation starter for this morning. I want to thank everybody, acknowledge the folks who fund our lab work, and also that there's many hands and people and processes in our work, because our work is often community-based. We have very elaborate processes of permissions, of consultation, of review of everything we do. So there's a lot of people involved. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Murphy. Totally. It's a frame shift that's just incredibly valuable, and that I know we're all going to be reflecting on for a long time. So we really appreciate you sharing even just a little snippet of your work with us this morning. I have a lot of questions, and we thought we would begin with a dialogue between the two of us, but I want to invite all those who are attending to also ask questions. Please don't use the chat, use the little Q&A function, the Q&A button, and if you really want to hear an answer to someone else's questions, you can upvote the question and I will direct those to Murphy. But we're going to begin with a little conversation between the two of us. And I wrote down a quote as you were speaking because it affected me so much when you said, you know, data is collected about molecules, but molecules is not how the world works. And it resonated with me on many levels, as someone with a degree in biochemistry, but also as a family doctor. And it reminded me very much of the way in which family medicine, when we do it well, which we know is not always, we have been taught is supposed to be about this sort of biopsychosocial model. And so, you know, that knee is connected to a whole person, and that person is connected to a family and to a community and to an environment and to social determinants of health, all of which bring the knee to the office. And that in family medicine, we're supposed to be integrative and holistic in our thinking. We're supposed to think beyond a body part or a diagnosis or a disease and to see the whole person and the context. But we, I would say, have not graduated to a level of thinking that sees that in relation to land. And so this is a new, at least I will say for myself, a new dimension in thinking about what is that person connected to and what is contributing to the, you know, can continue with my my thing that with to the knee. And so I'm wondering if you could just reflect a little and react a little about how you think, I mean, medicine in general, but really in particular primary care, which is a community-based discipline, would look different if we were able to incorporate this land-body relation that you're talking about into our daily work.
That's really a hard question because I imagine that your daily work is not set up to take this on, just like in normative environmental research is not set up to take this on. And so it takes a lot of shifting the terms of practice in order to really address land-body relations. As the first thing is that Indigenous land-body relations are important to share, to offer as another way of understanding the world, and that there's different legal jurisdiction here that's calling you into account. But it's not that you are invited to appropriate the epistemologies of Indigenous people. So then it can be tricky, right? So how do we understand land-body relations, learning with and next to Indigenous people, but without appropriating their place? So there's a kind of reflection that has to happen, I think, for the clinician in terms of their own situation as probably mostly settlers, right, in this history of land-body relation. So I guess that would be one thing. Another is, I think that a lot of science and probably medicine is stuck on a Cartesian thought, which is small things make up big things. And the sciences that we work with have that baked in. Small things are the building blocks to make up big things. And in this way of thinking, it's an invitation to understand that Cartesian scales and spaces actually aren't the best way to explain the world. That massive things that we think are small might actually be massive. And massive things might make up small things. And so it's interesting, like, you know, how physicists have been chasing like the Higgs boson particle and they can't find it. And they're like, why can't we find it? And one of the kind of thinking is, oh, we've been assuming small things make up big things. And maybe that's not how even particle physics work. So rethinking kind of what makes up what and being aware that Cartesian scale can lead you down unethical roads or lead you down roads that pull you away from understanding the ethics and responsibilities at work in our relations. when we understand that big things make up small, or big things are manifesting in the small, then we're forced out into ethical relations and forced out into that, wholeness, or the complexity of wholeness, right? That you were describing. So I think that's one way. And we can even do that looking at data in, let's say, in clinical encounters. So we often just take data as like a quantitative measure of an instrument, but that data is full of so many relations. It is full of big relations. And what does it tell us, and what does it not tell us in terms of being able to act as ethical beings, as doctors? And so in a lot of our work, it's about bringing our values and relations into the data that science presents us when it does not care about colonialism, or doesn't care about waters and lands. But there's a lot of work that goes into it. So another example is our app. To rebuild relations into the data of a chemical takes years, actually, of work. It's not small work. So the invitation actually is to a large project, a large collective project, but that is what is needed to address the scale of environmental violence that we're facing.
Well, to build on this notion of large project, when we think about the core work of our own department, which is, fundamentally, like our job is to produce family physicians. That's the widget that comes out of the work of a faculty of medicine is a doctor, if I can be reductive in that way. And I think we struggle to think about, well, what does it mean to educate and support emergence of physicians who see themselves not only as clinical experts, but who have those skills of reflexiveness and understand their social accountability and see themselves as members of a community, and not just focus on individual patients, but think about population health and the determinants of health. I mean, I would say, like, that's a journey that all of medicine is on, and like, we're not at the destination yet, but it's something that we engage with a lot and think about a lot. What does it look like to do really engaged, socially accountable education of family physicians? And I'm wondering, because you've referenced once or twice the amount of work that goes into the generation of your products, if I can put it that way, the amount of community engagement, the amount of dialogue, permission seeking, infrastructure, relationship building before you can produce an app or whatever your product might be. Yeah. Can you reflect a little bit on what you've learned about good ways of growing our academic product out of really, like, meaningful community engagement?
Yeah. So there is that slogan that I think came out of disability studies or disability justice, which but as spread, which is like, nothing about us without us. So that slows things down, because then you have to figure out a mode of research, of co-theorizing, of co-researching with people who are most affected by whatever it is you're working on, and are not probably in the university. And so, how the university wants to deal with this is through EDI schemes of, increasing, like, the demographic presence of different communities, but without changing the epistemology or the, like, ways of knowing or the ways of doing of those fields. But it actually requires a different way of knowing and doing that brings in the people most affected as the leaders of the research. and as the expert. So we, constantly have to be in our work, understand that, when you're in Chemical Valley, you are viscerally overwhelmed by the smells, the loud sounds. You're surrounded by hundreds of tanks. You don't know what's in them. Rusty processors, you don't know what's happening. Flares, I mean, it is astounding, visceral experience. And you cross the fence line into Amjanong, and it is green. Amjanong has been defending its territory against some of the biggest, most polluting forces on the planet for 150 years. So the people of Amjanong are the experts, are some of the world's greatest experts on chemical pollution and what it does and how it's working. And so in our work, we must start there and be guided and led by those experts and humble ourselves to know that what we have to offer is not that expertise. So it's a different kind of research, and it does go slower, because to actually be ethical or to take up ethics in that way goes slow. And that can be hard, because probably in the clinical setting, you get 15 minutes to see someone, right? When I work with chemists, they also hear in their ear, move fast and break things, the Silicon Valley way of doing things. And we always have to be saying, if you do that, you are going to, do harm. You are going to be Oppenheimer. It's no small thing, the harm you can do. And so this slower way of doing research might seem less acting to the urgency, but is what offers, to my mind, the forms that are desire-based for the different way that you would go forward with. So something like that.
Yeah, I think that's really wise, and it leads me to the very first question in our Q&A from Jenny Kwong, who it's a pretty specific question, and if you need to reflect on it, Murphy, and we can post your answer later, that's fine too. But Jenny is specifically wanting to do more reading and asks, can you suggest books or resources that we can read more about how we can incorporate these perspectives and Indigenous perspectives into the work of science? And I suspect that you have an impressive library. So there was one book that you recommended in your presentation, but maybe, if one leaps to mind or a few leap to mind, great. Otherwise, we could come back to you and post on our website your suggestions at a later date.
Well, for environmental health, I do really recommend Violence on the Land, Violence on the Body is a really beautiful report. But a classic starting place is Linda Tui Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies. And then I would also suggest Eve Tuck's letter called Suspending Damage, which is a call to researchers to change the way they research what we could call over-researched communities, who also usually bear the greatest burden and density of harm, and how to move to desire-based work with them.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, and we will post that list when we post the video. Thank you. David White asks a question about the ways in which medical work contributes to pollution. And he says, in our everyday work as doctors, we use gloves made of vinyl, latex, or nitrile, all with damaging effects. And, of course, that one of the big examples is anesthetic gases. And we know that if healthcare as an industry were around the world were counted as a polluting force, it would be among the most significant emitters of carbon in the world. So we have a problem as the healthcare industrial complex is also contributing.
Yes.
At the same time that we are, we're creating work for ourselves, if you will. At the same time that we are purporting to be in the healing business. Do you have thoughts about what what a better way to think of to approach that that might be. We undermine ourselves if we believe ourselves to be healers.
I mean, this is a really interesting one, because also you get conflicts with like disability justice in this space. But yeah, so obviously the medical industry is incredibly addicted to disposable plastics, as and justifies this as a kind of like harm reducing thing, or an infrastructural thing that one can't get out of. For me, when I think about plastics, it's not just the disposability of plastics, but where are plastics made? Plastics are made in Chemical Valley. Plastics is what is making the benzene at 60 times the level of a comparable refinery in the United States, that's giving generations of blood cancers along the St. Clair River. So there's a whole upstream dimension to this that brings us back to fossil fuels as the source for our substance. So if we really want to think about this, it is connected. And then interestingly, in this big gigantic project about substance creation, they're building a building on campus for it, which is kind of exciting. And our kind of Indigenous space is going to be next to another lab who asked to be next to us, which I'm pretty excited about, run by Helen Tran. And they develop alternative polymers to plastic. So the question of can we make substances? Right now we make substances with no care, and we allow substances, plastics, with no care to their relation to justice and harm. Really, the level of regulation of substance, if I could spend an hour with you on this, it is so low, like at the end you will like be crying, it is terrible. And we imagine Canada might be good at this, and that is just so wrong. And so to me, it's interesting to think about working at the research level. What can we do if we can't trust the nation state to regulate these darn things? To be working with chemists, with mechanical engineers, with materials engineers on the creation of other kinds of substances that can support healthcare. So that could be one way in. Yeah,
and I think, it's interesting when we won't have time to get into the passing reference in your talk to regulatory capture. You don't use those words, but I'll use them with your permission. Which we see hugely in pharmaceutical policy in Canada. Yes. And so this notion that the best folks to regulate themselves are themselves, and that the best folks to determine the price of something are the ones who made it, is pervasive, and yes, certainly pervasive in biotechnology as well as in medicine. Our last question will be a mashup of two questions. My attempt to satisfy two of our attendees today, which relates to time. And this, so both, a couple of people asked about sort of when in family medicine, we talk about quality improvement, which is like quality improvement TM, which is often about making small change, incremental change, rapid change, measuring, adapting, and, trying to make things better quickly. And small goals, which allow you to achieve bigger things over time. And another one of our attendees is asking about time to build relationship and interact with a whole person. And as you've identified, how hard that is to do given the constraints that we operate within. Do we have it wrong completely? Like, should we be thinking about time and relationship and the bigness or smallness of our goals in a completely different way? And are there ways in which you have challenged concepts of small change or small time in your own work that you think would be useful to us?
That's interesting. You know, to keep ourselves going in this work, which can be very pessimistic work. We talk about like how to be beyond pessimism in our work. So our steps have to bring joy and pleasure and community in the immediate as we do what work that we understand to be intergenerationally long. So we understand the task as intergenerationally long. We don't expect to achieve it in the immediate. We do harm reduction, but we also must do pleasure manifestation. The two have to go together or you're not going to make it. We do talk about taking one step at a time a lot. But we also talk about, when we say the land behind the fence is not sacred, that in the process, we are valuing and working with them in the places of our damage, and bringing it love and care. And that's a kind of different mode maybe than in the doctor's office, and I think maybe there's also an atomism in the doctor's office with the one patient and a person, I don't know, where in the work we're doing, it always has to be in community and collective. We can't do anything on our own. We will not make it, on our own. And when I say make it, I don't just mean like make a product. I mean like we will not like make it through the week alone. And so I think there is some resonances to how you all are thinking, but maybe this kind of large intergenerational sense of like what is being attempted to accomplish, and how many generations, ancestors, people in the contemporary and those yet to come are involved in the effort. Like it's a big vision of that kind of can lift you, but it's also, you're just humble inside of it. You can only.
That's beautiful. And I think I do actually think it has tremendous relevance. It resonates with me a lot. And this notion that we can dream on an intergenerational scale about health and how it's produced, but take small steps and with care and love of each other, of ourselves, of the communities we serve, at the same time, I think is really powerful.
And land body intergenerational is not just human intergenerational. So that's the other side to it.
Yeah, and I think that's one I think we need to think about as a department, frankly. And we are launching we hope the EDU on health and climate change and sustainability. So we're going to come back to you, Murphy, as we begin thinking about what our work in that space might look like. Well, with that, I want to say a huge thank you, express the gratitude on behalf of our department and of our discipline for the work that you do, which is so important, and particularly that you were able to join us today as U of T honors the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I think especially meaningful. It's been a really amazing conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to invite everyone to mark their calendars. Our November speaker is Mayor Olivia Chow, Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow at the next New Horizons session. And we look forward to welcoming Mayor Chow and thinking about how does municipal action support health and relate to our work as family doctors and learners in family medicine. So thank you all very much. And I wish you all a wonderful Friday. Take care, everybody.